Amara strolled through the park, her favorite escape after a stressful week of school. The air was crisp, and the sun filtered through the autumn leaves. As she rounded a bend, she saw him, Officer Brent Richards. His sharp blue eyes locked onto her like a predator spotting prey. Her instinct told her to turn back, but she straightened her shoulders and kept walking, her father's voice echoing in her mind, "Always stand tall, Amara. Never let them see you shrink." As she approached, Richard stepped directly into her path. Well, he drawled, a smirk curling at the corner of his lips. "If it isn't Sergeant Johnson's little princess." Amara froze. She had encountered officers from her father's precinct before, but something about Richard's tone unsettled her. "Good afternoon, officer," she said cautiously. Richards didn't move. Instead, his gaze swept over her, his expression turning cold. "You think just because your daddy wears a badge, you can do whatever you want, huh?" he sneered, "roaming around here like you own the place." Amara frowned, confusion creeping into her voice. "I was just walking. I didn't "Don't interrupt me," Richards barked, his voice suddenly sharp. He took a step closer, towering over her. "You kids think you're so entitled. Bet you think the rules don't apply to you because Daddy worked his way up the affirmative action ladder." Amara's breath caught in her throat. What she whispered, her voice trembling. Richards leaned in, his smirk returning. "Oh, don't play innocent. Your dad wouldn't be where he is if this department wasn't so desperate to check its diversity boxes. And now his little princess thinks she's untouchable." Amara clenched her fists, anger bubbling beneath her fear. "My father earned his position. He works harder than anyone." Quiet, Richards snapped, his hand gripping her arm suddenly. "Watch your tone, little girl. You don't speak to an officer like that." She gasped, trying to pull free, but his grip only tightened. The humiliation of his words cut deeper than the pain in her arm. The laughter of children playing in the distance seemed a cruel contrast to the venomous encounter unfolding. "You'll learn your place," Richards muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're not special. Remember that." By the time Amara reached her father, her arm was sore, and her heart was pounding. Sergeant Malcolm Johnson listened in stunned silence as she recounted the encounter, his face hardening with every word. He said what he finally asked, his voice low and dangerous. "He said you only got your job because you're black," Amara whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Malcolm's jaw tightened. "That man will answer for this," he said firmly, pulling out his phone. But the fight was only beginning. By the next morning, Richards had already filed a report, accusing Amara of being defiant and hostile. He claimed she had refused to comply and that he had acted to ensure public safety. The language was coded, but Malcolm recognized the stereotypes, justifications often used to discredit black individuals. At the precinct, Captain Raymond Daniels greeted Malcolm with a stiff smile. "Malcolm, you know how these things go," Daniels said, waving a hand dismissively. "Kids exaggerate. Richard says he was just doing his job." Malcolm slammed a folder onto the desk. "This isn't the first complaint against him, Ray, you know that." Daniels sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Look, I can't throw one of my officers under the bus without solid evidence. Besides, Richards has a good record." "Because you've been covering for him," Malcolm interrupted, his voice rising. "How many complaints have been buried? How many times has he crossed the line?" Daniels' eyes narrowed. "Careful, Johnson, you don't want to make this personal." "This is personal," Malcolm shot back, his voice steady but laced with fury. "That's my daughter." The tension in the room was palpable, but Malcolm knew the truth: the system would protect Richards unless he fought harder. As he walked out of the office, he felt the weight of systemic racism pressing down on him, but he also felt the fire of determination. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Reverend Elijah King stood on the makeshift stage in the heart of the park, his voice unwavering as he addressed the crowd. His words carried the weight of generations of struggle. "This is not just about Amara Johnson," he began, his deep, resonant voice cutting through the murmurs of the gathered crowd. "This is about every child who has been told they are less than. Every family who has had to live in fear of those sworn to protect them. Today we say enough is enough." The park was packed with thousands of people, young and old, from different races and backgrounds. Families carried signs that read "Justice for Amara" and "End Police Brutality." Children sat on their parents' shoulders, their faces solemn as they absorbed the gravity of the moment. Local pastors, activists, and community leaders took turns at the microphone, sharing stories of racial profiling and injustice. Amara stood near the stage, holding her father's hand. Her presence was a silent testament to the courage that had sparked this movement. Reverend King gestured toward her, his voice rising. This young girl had the courage to stand up. Now it's our turn. We will march today not just for her but for every victim of systemic oppression. And we will keep marching until justice is served. As the crowd surged forward, marching through the city streets, the chants grew louder: no justice, no peace, and protect our children. National media crews lined the sidewalks, their cameras capturing the powerful display of unity. Amara felt overwhelmed but emboldened by the sight of so many strangers standing together for her. At one point, a woman she didn't know leaned down and whispered, "You're so brave, sweetheart. Thank you for giving us hope." Amara squeezed her father's hand, her fear temporarily replaced by a glimmer of pride. Back at the precinct, Sergeant Malcolm Johnson walked through the station, his shoulders tense under the weight of silent stares. White officers turned their backs as he passed, their whispered conversations cutting into him like shards of glass. One of them, Officer Daniels, didn't bother lowering his voice. "Sold us out to the press," he sneered. "Might as well hand in his badge." Malcolm stopped but didn't turn around. He knew better than to take the bait. Instead, he continued toward the briefing room, where a small group of black officers had gathered in solidarity. Their quiet presence was a reminder that he wasn't alone. Detective Sofia Ramirez entered the room, holding a thick file. Her face was grim as she spread the documents on the table. "Richards has a history," she began, her voice steady but tinged with anger. 7 complaints filed in the last 3 years. All of them involving people of color. None of them followed up. One officer, a young black man named Jerome Carter, clenched his fists. "And we're just hearing about this now? How many more kids like Amara are out there because the department covered for him?" Malcolm placed a hand on Jerome's shoulder, grounding him. "This ends now," he said firmly. He turned to Ramirez. "What's our next move?" "We push this up the chain," Ramirez replied. "The media is already watching. If we expose this pattern, they can't ignore it anymore." The room fell into a determined silence. They all knew the risks of taking on the system from within, but Malcolm's voice broke through, steady and resolute. "We fight. Not just for Amara, but for everyone who's been silenced. If they want to turn their backs on us, let them. We'll make sure they have no choice but to face the truth." Their resolve solidified, the group left the room, ready to face the battles ahead. The council chamber buzzed with tension as Amara Johnson sat beside her father, Sergeant Malcolm Johnson. The air was heavy with skepticism and judgment, amplified by the imposing presence of Captain Raymond Daniels, who towered near the podium, his voice calm but cutting. "These are serious accusations," Daniels began, his tone dripping with practiced authority. "However, without concrete proof, we cannot tarnish the reputation of a dedicated officer like Brent Richards. He has served this department honorably for years." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, daring anyone to challenge him. "What we have here is hearsay, fueled by emotion." Councilman Todd Hayes nodded in agreement. "Captain Daniels raises a valid point," he said, his voice measured. "Without evidence, it's difficult to justify drastic action. We need to ensure fairness for everyone involved, including Officer Richards." Amara gripped her father's hand tightly, feeling the weight of doubt pressing down on her. But Malcolm leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "You've got this, Amara. Speak your truth." Taking a deep breath, Amara stood, her legs trembling but her resolve firm. She approached the microphone, her young voice carrying a mixture of fear and determination. "I may not have physical evidence," she began, her gaze locking with Councilman Hayes. "But I have my experience and I have my voice. Officer Richards didn't just abuse his authority. He humiliated me. He made me feel small because of the color of my skin. He said my father's rank didn't matter, that I was just another kid who thought she was special." Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. "How many others has he done this to? How many more have been too scared to speak out?" The room fell silent, her words lingering like an open wound. Councilwoman Diane Morgan leaned forward, her expression a mix of anger and empathy. "This is exactly why we're here today," Morgan said, her voice firm. "To ensure that no child, no citizen, ever feels like they are powerless in the face of those who are supposed to protect them. Dismissing this as hearsay perpetuates the very system we're trying to change." Detective Sofia Ramirez stood next, clutching a stack of documents. "Amara's case is not an isolated incident," she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "Internal records show multiple complaints against Officer Richards, many from minority families. These were buried, ignored, or conveniently resolved." She held up the documents. "This is evidence, suppressed by those who refuse to hold Richards accountable." Gasps echoed through the chamber as she handed copies to the council members. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at the incriminating reports. Amara caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes as the council members exchanged uneasy glances. Outside the council building, students, teachers, and parents flooded the street. Their signs held high justice for Amara and end police impunity. Tasha Nguyen stood at the forefront, her megaphone in hand. "We will not let this be swept under the rug," Tasha called out, her voice strong and impassioned. "Today we stand with Amara. Tomorrow we stand for every child who deserves to feel safe." The crowd erupted in cheers as Jamal Carter, Amara's best friend, streamed the rally live to thousands of viewers. "Justice for Amara is trending," he shouted, his phone glowing with notifications. "We're not just local anymore, we're national." Inside, Councilman Hayes sat quietly, scrolling through his phone. The growing wave of public outrage was undeniable. Comments flooded his feed, some supportive, others furious. A video of Amara's testimony, uploaded minutes ago, was rapidly gaining traction. A sense of unease washed over him as he thought of his own daughter. Could he stand by and let this slide? With a deep breath, Hayes raised his hand. "I've reconsidered my stance," he said, his voice cracking slightly. All eyes turned to him. "Amara's testimony and this community's outcry cannot be ignored. I support the motion for reform." Councilwoman Morgan smiled, her nod subtle but affirming. Outside, the crowd roared as news spread of Hayes' reversal. Tasha led a chant, the collective power of the voices reverberating through the streets. Amara stepped out of the council chamber into the sunlight, greeted by the cheers of her community. Malcolm placed a protective arm around her shoulder, his pride evident. "We're not done yet," Amara said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "Not even close," Malcolm replied, as they walked into the crowd ready to face the next chapter of their fight together. The council chamber was packed with tension, the air thick with the murmur of restless voices. Every seat was filled, and many stood along the walls, their faces a mix of hope and defiance. At the center, Councilwoman Diane Morgan addressed the room with a steady voice, her gaze unwavering as she announced the council's decision. After reviewing the investigation and listening to the testimonies, Morgan said, "We, as a council, vote unanimously to suspend Officer Brent Richards indefinitely and move forward with proposed police reform measures." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, a wave of relief and vindication washing over them. Malcolm Johnson, seated in the front row with his daughter Amara, let out a slow, deep breath. His grip on Amara's shoulder tightened briefly in reassurance. For Malcolm, this victory wasn't just about his daughter, it was about decades of watching systemic injustice go unchecked. As the council continued detailing the implementation of mandatory bias training and the establishment of a community oversight board, Malcolm's mind raced with the possibilities these changes could bring. Later, as they left the chamber, Reverend Elijah King approached Malcolm. "Brother Johnson," the Reverend said, clasping his hand, "this is just the beginning. The real work starts now." Malcolm nodded, "And I'll be there for it. I'm tired of standing by while young officers of color feel isolated and unsupported. If the system won't look out for them, then I will." True to his word, Malcolm began mentoring young black officers. In a small room at the community center, he gathered a group of new recruits. "You don't have to face this alone," he told them, his voice resolute. "You belong here just as much as anyone else. Together we'll make this system better, not for their approval, but for our survival." Months later, Amara stood on a stage in front of a national audience, her heart pounding as she faced hundreds of lawmakers, activists, and community leaders. Her story had drawn attention far beyond her hometown, and now she was being asked to speak at a forum on police reform. I was just a girl in a park, she began, her voice trembling but steadying with each word. I didn't think my life mattered to someone like Officer Richards. I didn't think my voice could ever be heard. But I was wrong. The room was silent as Amara recounted her harrowing experience, her words painting a vivid picture of fear, humiliation, and resilience. She spoke about the support of her father, the community's rally behind her, and the change they demanded together. But this isn't just about me, Amara continued, her tone firm. This is about every person who has ever felt powerless against those sworn to protect them. It's about holding people accountable no matter their badge, no matter their rank. Her speech concluded with a call to action. We need external investigations for police misconduct. No more internal cover-ups. No more protecting abusers. If my story can inspire change, then I know we can create a system where justice isn't just a word, but a reality. The audience rose to their feet, applause thunderous. Amara stepped back, tears welling in her eyes. Later, as she walked off the stage, a senator approached her. Amara, the senator said, because of your courage, I'm proposing a bill for statewide reforms next week. It will include independent investigations. Your voice is making a difference. As she nodded, Amara felt the weight of her journey and the hope that had grown from it. She was no longer just a victim. She was a force for change,